Hi, I'm Jeff Lowe, Chief Executive Officer of Asian Sky Group, Asian Sky Media, here as part of our 2020 infrastructure report. This afternoon, I have as my guest Aljoscha from Asia Flight Services. He's the Business Development Manager, and it's a pleasure to have you. How are you today?
I am well. Thank you, Jeff, for having me.
Yeah. Now, the interesting side, as I just mentioned about, I think our discussion this afternoon is you're in Bangkok, but a lot of your business is then spread through Myanmar and Indochina, even Bangladesh, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yes.
Yeah. So for me, the topic of today is obviously infrastructure. And so the first sort of question we have, and it's the same set of questions we're asking everyone, is, given the areas where you're working, and even in Thailand, what are the infrastructure challenges that you see? And you might have to break it down a little bit, just because I'm sure it's different depending on, I would assume Laos is different than Thailand, for instance. So, but I'm very interesting to hear how you assess the infrastructure challenges that you've got.
Yeah, you're right. Obviously, every country is a bit different. But overall in the region that we sometimes like to call the Mekong region, because the river that flows through it. Obviously, we are dealing here with a lot of countries that have an overall maybe slightly lower level of development compared with some of the neighboring regions. And that obviously affects also airport infrastructure and everything that we need for business aviation. So for example, when it comes to FBOs, most of the locations won't have a dedicated business aviation terminal. So most of the time we have to process passengers and crew through the existing international terminal. Then there are challenges really relating to parking or slot availability, which is mainly due to the rise of commercial traffic, a lot of growth that we've seen over the last couple of years, which of course take up a lot of the availability when it comes to slots and parking.
Right. But obviously, with challenges comes great opportunity as well, potentially. Because as you say, it doesn't have much in the way of infrastructure at the moment. So has the activity levels as far as flights and fleet size gotten to a point now where the region really needs it, though, to function?
Yes, I think so. Obviously, most of the growth is still driven by traffic that originates from outside the region.
Yep.
It's passengers and operators that come in from Greater China, from Singapore, from the Indian subcontinent, Middle East, and Europe. But we have seen more and more over the last couple of years demand increasing locally for passengers that like to charter to travel within the region or originating within the region, which is something relatively new for us, which gives us a great deal of hope for future growth once the borders open up again.
All right. And so for you at the moment, I guess, what were your expectations, or what was the state of the industry in your areas towards the end of 2019? And again, I just asked to try to get an idea, and then COVID hit. I mean, what was it like before that? What kind of activity levels and business levels were you seeing in the region? And then we'll talk about what happened after the pandemic came.
Yeah, it depends a bit again.
And again, sorry, because as you said, it's a developing area, and so certainly from some of the analysis that we do, it's a very interesting area because there is, if you will, a high percentage of growth, but on a unit basis, it's not necessarily a huge fleet, but it is growing significantly, and certainly in some of the countries that you're present in.
That's true. Yes, we are starting from a relatively small base, but the growth rates are impressive. Obviously, business aviation is heavily correlated to general economic growth. And there we have some of the countries with the highest average growth rates of all of Asia. I think Vietnam was topping the list just last year. So there's a lot of potential that we see in that regard. Most of the traffic is still leisure related. We have a lot of casino related travel, for example, in
Cambodia. Yep.
In Thailand, obviously, is more business oriented when we're looking at Bangkok, but the south of Thailand again is mostly leisure traffic. So we were very optimistic and had quite a lot of growth towards the end of 2019, and then the COVID hit and the situation changed quite drastically.
So what's the status at the moment? And again, obviously, to a certain extent, every country is handling the pandemic differently, but through the region, what has been the impact and what kind of restrictions are you seeing or trying to work under?
Yeah, obviously, like most countries, the borders are effectively closed for all our countries. There have been a couple of interesting exceptions, like, for example, the case of Cambodia, which allowed crew to enter, active crew members to enter the country relatively easily throughout the pandemic. They always had a visa on arrival available for operating crew, which made Cambodia a very attractive choice for operators that needed a overnight stop to get in their mandatory crew rest. So that was a very interesting option to have in Southeast Asia. On the negative side, bringing it back to infrastructure, there was a quite a reduction in many countries in the number of airports of entry. So the authorities might say we will restrict international arrivals to only 1 or 2 airports in the country, just so that they can focus the testing and all the health facilities in that particular location.
Right.
And even when it comes to hotels, for example, the authorities might prescribe in which hotels arriving crew and passengers are allowed to stay. So that we saw quite a bit of restrictions, of course, also infrastructure related once COVID hit.
All right, but has flight activity pretty much stopped entirely, or is it there's still activity going on, but it's more repatriation flights or essential services flights?
Yes, you're right that it hasn't stopped completely, but of course the purpose of flights shifted quite a bit. So leisure traffic is effectively not possible anymore, even though Thailand was in the news over many weeks about their special tourist visa, which they launched. But still operating flights is not easy because the permissions always have to go through the diplomatic channels. So most of the business aviation traffic that we are seeing is repatriation flights. We have a couple of business related travel trips as well, where when we have local companies that are willing to sponsor guests to come into the country for important business meetings, that is possible with given enough lead time and then the required documentation. We also saw a change in Cambodia recently, where they now make available such an option for business travelers to start having business meeting on day 3 after their arrival in Cambodia, which means they don't have to do the full 14-day quarantine before they can have meetings. So the governments are aware of the importance of business aviation for these kind of trips.
Right. Well, that's kind of the next question. What are they doing to, I think very much in the news for most countries is the kind of support that the commercial side of the business and the airlines are getting, and airports to that extent as well. But are they, and you kind of just answered it a little bit there, they're obviously aware of business aviation. Are they likewise extending support to people like yourself or operators in the region?
Yeah, some of the relief measures that you mentioned obviously also affect business jet operators. For example, Thailand and Myanmar have put in place measures to reduce certain aeronautical charges like air navigation, landing fees, parking fees, which would also apply to business jet operators, just to kind of alleviate the financial burden of flying internationally into these countries. And then I think it is important to mention also that many of the CAAs in the region are very supportive when it comes to business aviation. In the same vein, also a lot of embassies in the countries have been supportive when it comes to the landing clearances, which, as I've mentioned, always need to go through the diplomatic channels. So for these repatriation flights that I mentioned earlier, we always have to work with the embassy of the passengers involved. And we found that they have been very responsive and very supportive in doing that. So we appreciate that very much.
Okay. Now, just sort of maybe backtracking a little bit. I mean, when we talk about infrastructure, we're obviously talking about airports. We're talking about FBOs and MRO. If I was to sort of take each one, are there enough airports, do you feel?
There are probably enough airports. It depends what what you want to do. Myanmar, for example, to take just a case, has, I believe, over 30 operational airports. But the question is, to what level are they developed and opened up for general use? So currently, of those over 30 airports, only 3 are airports of entry, where you would be allowed to arrive internationally. And currently,
so only 3 of them have a
to overnight. So it's very restrictive.
Yeah. Okay. And so when you then think about FBOs, I mean, you've got to have. Do you have any FBOs?
It depends a bit on your definition. I find that sometimes the American definition and the Asian definition of an FBO.
I'm not counting VIP terminals. Okay, that doesn't count.
Exactly. So I guess in the American definition of an FBO, we don't have too many traditional FBO operators. From a passenger point of view, the experience in a so-called VIP terminal and an FBO might not be too different, because for most of the passengers, obviously the speed of service is the most important, and being discreet and being processed apart from any commercial passengers, especially nowadays where you want to limit the number of interactions with other people that you have. So in that regard, we do have certain locations where we can make use of these so-called VIP terminals. But then again, we also found out that in Vietnam, for example, the government has limited in 2019 the use of those VIP terminals to business jet travel. So most of the time, as I said, we still have to use the main international terminals, which of course puts some limitations on the standard of service that we can provide.
So with no dedicated FBO, because again, if you go by the US model to a certain degree, the MRO facilities are also tied to the FBO facilities. So throughout again your area, Indochina, Myanmar, I mean, what's the situation for MRO and maintenance facilities?
MRO is not my specialty, to be honest, but as far as I understand it, the only place where we would have some kind of substantial MRO support would be in Thailand, mainly in Bangkok. There has been a lot of talk about developing Utapao Airport, about 2 hours south of Bangkok, into a big MRO hub. But that project has also kind of been stalled and delayed with COVID.
Sure.
Most of the other locations, there's very limited MRO support, some line maintenance, basic stuff, but not to the extent of other big airports that we have in the region.
Right. If you had to pick and choose a star of the region, one of the countries, if you will, that seems to be maybe putting business aviation to the forefront and really, if you will, trying to tackle some of the issues, is there a star amongst the group, or are they all sort of just plodding along at the same speed?
It's quite varied between the countries, I would say. Obviously, Thailand is the only country of the ones that I'm talking about with a substantial number of local operators.
Well, given the countries we're talking about, I consider Thailand a mature market. Okay.
Exactly. So in Thailand, there's a group of local operators.
Yeah, sure.
Have an interest of developing the business aviation industry, and ASBA has been quite active here over the last couple of years as well, advocating for business aviation interests. But other countries should also be kept in mind, like Cambodia and Vietnam, where we've seen so much growth of traffic coming in from other regions. So we believe that the local authorities and the airport operators are aware of the demand that is there, and that will probably come back pretty quickly once the borders open up. So I hope they will continue to keep us in mind. Okay.
This is the last question, which is a crystal ball question. Obviously, as you say, the region is going through a fairly healthy growth rate spurt. Maybe it was dampened, obviously, by the pandemic, which is understandable. But where would you see, or what would you see or expect to happen over the next 2, 3, 5 years? And where do you think the region will be in that sort of a time frame? And again, we're particularly relating to infrastructure, but also, I'm interested in your overall comments just regarding business aviation too.
Yeah, okay, I will speculate a bit maybe. As I said, there's a lot of.
You are responsible for business development, so you've got to speculate a little bit, okay? Because that's where the opportunities are going to be. So
maybe it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
There you are, and we've got it on tape. So okay.
So yeah, as I said, there's a lot of latent demand, I believe, of traffic that will happen as soon as the regulations allow. So that the initial growth that will come once the borders open, I think will be, there won't be too much delay with that. But then once the commercial traffic also picks up again, which might be a couple of months later, we will again be faced with that old problem of commercial traffic pushing out business aviation traffic.
Being second fiddle, you're number 2 on the list.
We will rely again on the airport operators and the civil aviation authorities to make room for us, both in terms of regulation and in terms of infrastructure, to be able to continue to grow. Otherwise, we will be kind of stuck there until these facilities are developed. But we have a couple of interesting projects in the region, which I believe give us hope for the growth of business aviation. So, for example, in Phuket, in the south of Thailand, the local operator Siamland has been developing an FBO, which was a bit delayed due to COVID, but is set to open the beginning of next year, which is very interesting because Phuket is traditionally very difficult to operate to for business jets. Most operators will not be allowed to overnight there. They have to reposition after dropping off the passengers. So that is an interesting project to look at next year. And likewise, there's a similar project in Cambodia in the south in Sihanoukville, where Cambodia Airports, the airport operator, has built a VIP terminal, like they call it, which is also set to open soon and will allow us to process crew and passengers quickly and discreetly away from the main terminal. So there are a couple of interesting projects which are about to open soon, which gives me some hope for business aviation in the Mekong region.
Yeah, we definitely need hope. Okay. Okay, that's great. Again, I appreciate you taking the time this afternoon and sitting down with us. Some interesting insights on the, as you say, on the Mekong Delta, if you want to call it that, through the Indochina, Myanmar. So I thank you very much for spending the time today.
My pleasure, Jeff.